We all have our demons.
Not enough pain.
What's up, everybody? It's Kaelrian, aka Chugmug, this character, aka Saladolin, aka Video Babo XE, aka Video Babo, aka Bobby D. How's it going? This video is going to be kind of more of a freeform thing. I just wanted to kind of have a story time with my Tanxiety video coming out earlier this week. I thought it'd be cool to kind of stop for a minute and talk about how I got into tanking, because I've also had my video about healing in Legion come out this week, and the big thread that you'll find there is that I haven't been tanking all that long. Probably just over 2 years now. And even with alts, I didn't really tank that much up until the back end of Warlords of Draenor. So I think the biggest things I just wanted to talk about from a storytelling perspective is what made me get into tanking, what made me overcome the anxiety, the tremendous anxiety I felt about it, and how I ended up basically main tanking and leveling a bunch of tanks today. So, I mean, I think the first thing is that a lot of people play in MMOs what their group dynamic allows. I know for me, a lot of the decision about what characters I've played for the past like 7 years now has really been built around what my guildmates are playing more than anything. I've been generally flexible, but I've almost always played a non-DPS role, bearing a few stunts where I went Shadow as a priest. And I think the most interesting reason why that is that in most MMOs I play, pretty much every MMO I play really, DPS doesn't matter. And I know that's controversial and kind of mean to say, and I know that there's people queuing up comments right now, so I won't stop you. But I think what needs to be said about DPS is that DPS as a role in an MMO feels the least important, and often is. Not because they aren't important as players, but because the game isn't really built in a way where DPS can drastically influence the outcome of a raid encounter or a PvP situation. I've always enjoyed playing healers and tanks because, especially in World of Warcraft, it feels like they matter. I'm able to do things on those kinds of characters that I just can't do as a DPS. The decisions I make and the things that I do matter. They matter a lot more than they do as a DPS. And that's kind of a design problem, I feel like. Like, there's definitely a challenge there for a game designer in making DPS engaging. But I think that as long as the Holy Trinity exists as a gameplay model in MMOs, it's just always going to be the way that it is. You can build DPS roles to have greater player agency so that they feel like they have a little bit more stuff that they can do. They have a little more ability to influence outcomes. But generally, as long as tanks and healers sort of drive the pace and flow of the way the game plays, those roles are always going to be the most powerful. They're always going to be the most able to influence the outcome of a fight or an encounter. DPS are important. They just have the smallest measurable impact of any role of the Holy Trinity. But getting back on topic, I've always enjoyed healing. I still like healing even on alts and off specs, which is why my first full-time tank was a monk, was this character here, Chugmug, because healing to me is really the most interesting role in most Holy Trinity games because it has the greatest amount of choice built in. Generally, even with tanking, you tend to have a rotation. There's sort of a fixed series of events that you're going to go through. You're going to go through most of your DPS abilities in a very samey order to generate maximum DPS output. And then occasionally, you're going to have to stop and pop some sort of defensive ability. Whether it's active mitigation in WoW or some fuller-fledged cooldown in another game. Or even in WoW. Like, you know, outside of that, you have a rotation. You might have to break for ads, you might have to break to make a positioning change, but ultimately, it always kind of feels the same.
Focus on rising every time you fall.
That's a new line from him. So, I've enjoyed healing because it breaks away from that. There's no other role in an MMO where you have such a large degree of ability to make an intelligent, informed decision about what you want to do and act on it. Healing allows me to choose between single target and AoE spells. It allows me to choose between HOTS and direct targeted heals. It allows me to choose between different types of cooldowns or maybe damage reduction or absorption effects depending on the class and spec and toolkit. You have just such a tremendous amount of choices, and they all are dynamic. When I've healed for a raid, there generally tends to be a sort of sameness that fits in because the raid always plays sort of the same way.
Good luck, Grandmaster.
And the end result of that is that my gameplay never really has to change that much. But then if you heal for an LFR group, it's different. If you heal for a dungeon group, it's different. If you go into a pug raid, their dynamic is different. If you heal in PvP, it's a very different dynamic. All of that really shifts around a lot. And you might think from that I would have more anxiety about healing than tanking, because I think once a lot of people start to understand the breadth of what healing offers and what healing can do, it makes others very nervous, I've noticed. But I've always kind of found that healing to me feels lower pressure, probably in part because it's less understood. Like in Final Fantasy XIV, it's definitely a cliche that a lot of people don't really understand what healers do and are very quick to blame them when something goes wrong in a group. And that's true, that happens. But it's also the case, I've noticed, that I generally don't have that kind of pressure as a healer. Like, in theory, people could blame me for a group going pear-shaped, and sometimes that has happened, but it's more common to point the finger at the tank, because the healer can't really pull. I mean, a healer can pull, but if you're a healer that pulls in a dungeon, you're a douchebag, unless the tank as specifically asked you to. I may have just had a group the other night on Kael'ri, and that made me say that, so if you're a shaman out there who likes pulling Arcway in advance, know that you're shit and I don't like you. Anyways, getting away from that, I think the biggest thing to take into account for people's anxiety levels with healing relative to tanking is that healing does feel sort of lower key. It's more calm and collected. I've never felt like as a healer that I've had, this big, stretch of time where I've been stressed out. You can have moments in a fight where their damage spikes or whatever, and that might make you, respond pretty quickly and get nervous. But ultimately, like when you're playing a healer, you have a lot of time to make decisions, and it helps especially that in both WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, a lot of effort goes into making sure that healers have not just agency, but also have a lot of ability to relax, assess the situation, and come back with the best possible option. You get a lot of chance to really think about and contemplate the decisions you're making in game. Tanks, on the other hand, are more visibly engaged in that process than healers are. Healers actually, I still think, have more choice, but what choice tanks get is more perceptible. You choose routes, you choose what trash gets pulled. If a group feels like a pull is going too slow, that's probably the tank's fault. It might not always be. As a tank, I've had groups where, you have a shitty healer or some situation where you would like to pull faster and you know that your potential is to pull faster, but you also know that the next trash pull that you would normally group with the one you're currently on has a big, group busting AoE effect that the healer's not going to keep up on. And so you kind of decide that you're not going to pull both because the healer can't put up with it. But you'll take the flak for that often, and getting into a blame game where you talk about how you're not pulling fast because of the healer often just makes everyone more mad at you. So tanking, I think, is actually probably bears the brunt of those decisions more, where a healer has more choices to make in terms of actual gameplay. I think the choices they make are more invisible to a player. Basically, healing can break down in a way that a player may not ever see unless they are a healer. Tanking can break down in ways that everybody sees, and when it does happen, everybody knows and everybody starts calling out the tank. So for a number of years, my gameplay in WoW was basically healing or DPSing as my priest. I didn't really roll alts until Wrath of the Lich King, at which point the first alt I rolled was a Death Knight, which was a pretty easy decision to make because I hate leveling. I still do. I really am not a fan of leveling content overall. So having a class that skipped 60 levels and was able to kind of faster get to the more interesting stuff in the game made a lot of sense to me. Like that was a great option that fit perfectly with what I wanted out of the game. So I leveled a Blood DK. At the time, Blood DK could be a DPS or a tank, so I was a DPS still. But it was during that expansion that I kind of started to think about what tanking ultimately would be like, and I started doing it a little bit in dungeons, mostly with friends and with guildies. I didn't fully like it, but the thing I think that I discovered and what led to me switching to a tank years later is that I discovered I didn't hate it either. I actually kind of got excited about tanking because I knew that when I tanked well, it felt really good. It was this positive experience. If I got through a dungeon successfully and I pulled at a pace that I felt comfortable with, and nobody complained, I felt pretty damn good about that. So it kind of planted a seed early on, but it helped that Blood DK tanking during Wrath of the Lich King, especially in later patches like 3.2, which is really when I started taking to tanking. It helped that Blood DK tanking at that point was kind of more the form that we would know and associate with it today. Like early on, it was pretty common for Death Knight tanks to be mostly Frost spec, just because they had the largest number of physical damage mitigation. But it started shifting to Blood pretty rapidly later on in Wrath of the Lich King, and during 3.2, when I really started tanking, I could tank as Blood very easily. At the time, though, I think the thing I disliked about it was that the gear game for tanks was way more difficult to kind of get your head around. Like, you had to balance hit, expertise, parry, dodge, and defense stat. So you had all of these different things with different caps, and generally as a tank you might not have focused a lot on hit or expertise. I can't really recall off the top of my head what it was like at that point in time, but I know that defense capping was pretty hard to manage well. I know that after that you probably wanted some parry as a Blood Death Knight, but it was kind of weird in that you didn't always want to really super max out parry. And then, you wanted some hit, some expertise, because it was important to your threat at the time, when threat actually did kind of matter, that you had at least a good percentage of your abilities hit and not get dodged or parried or blocked. So it was, that I think was the biggest thing that held me back from tanking more actively, is that I didn't like the stat game. I understand that some people liked it, probably a lot of people actually liked it, but having to do weird things like cap defense, or any stats really that didn't have a lot of great direct noticeable gameplay effect, wasn't that exciting. Defense capping was absolutely essential to playing a Blood DK or any tank, but it was also really fucking boring. Who wanted to do that? What excitement do you get from getting defense on gear? It doesn't give you any sort of visceral reaction. You don't get big critical strike numbers on your damage pop-ups. You don't get any sort of flashy visual effect. You just take less damage. So it's okay, great, I do better at my job. And I want to do better at my job in game, but kind of sucks. So I kind of didn't tank after Wrath of the Lich King. I don't think I really tanked at all during Cataclysm. I leveled up all of... at Cataclysm was actually the first expansion where I level capped every class in the game. But I never tanked during Cataclysm, and I think the main reason for that was just that while the game was simpler in Cataclysm. Mastery also added extra layers of depth to tank gameplay, and once I saw the difficulty of the Cataclysm launch dungeons, when you hit 85, I kind of noped out of tanking. Healing was stressful enough at that point, because I remember my early Grim Batal runs on my Priest, where running out of mana was a pretty common occurrence, and it was fun. Like, I don't want to get it twisted. There was something to that challenge that I wish the game had more of these days, but it was nerve-wracking. I would not do LFG dungeons for a while unless I had at least one guildie, if not two, especially if I could get a tank. If I could get a tank from the guild, I was all good to go. But outside of that, hell no. So it took me up until Mist of Pandaria to try tanking again, and at that point it was on this character and also on my Blood DK yet again. I actually leveled my Death Knight during Mist of Pandaria as Blood. I enjoyed Blood. I still actually kind of like Blood gameplay, but what I've noticed is that with the switch to active mitigation, Blood is fucking weird. Like, not having a active mitigation ability that like just serves as active mitigation kind of sucks. Like, I get that Death Strike works for people, and I understand why they have it that way, but I almost wish there was some dumb, like, Death Knight-y name for some ability that would just give you the benefit of active mitigation, instead of hitting Death Strike to manage a debuff that the game doesn't even really go out of its way to tell you much about. So, yeah, so I played a little bit of Blood DK during Mist of Pandaria, but I didn't play a lot of Mist of Pandaria in general due to life situations, which I won't get into too much here. There's a lot of stories I could tell there, but basically, after the launch of Throne of Thunder, about 3 or 4 weeks in, I didn't play the game for about 5 months after that point. I think I came back literally when 5.4 was launching, so I missed 5.3's launch altogether. My first YouTube channel under my Priest name, I actually had videos talking about the PTR. I actually rewatched them the other day when I was clearing out my hard drive to make space for videos for this channel, and it kind of cracked me up how much my ability to talk on camera and present has changed. I don't know if I'll link to those videos or not here. Probably not. But yeah, so I didn't play a whole lot of Mist of Pandaria, but I did some Brewmaster tanking. I did some Blood DK tanking during that expansion. I found myself liking it a little bit more, but I just played less, so it kind of gave way to me just playing Shadow. Because again, I didn't really heal much during that expansion either. I basically only ever healed when I needed a faster dungeon queue, and that was about it. So I didn't really tank at all as a main spec or even close to a main spec until Warlords of Draenor. I leveled all my alts to 100 pretty quick. I had a few that I leveled in the last stretch of the expansion, but I leveled a good number of them early on, including pretty much all my tank capable alts. But it wasn't until Hellfire Citadel launched. We actually, at the time, we had our Blood DK tank, and we had a Guardian Druid, and his hours at work changed for the Guardian Druid, so he was going to start missing 1 raid a week. So I was like, okay, well, I was healing on my Priest, and I thought, okay, well, I could switch to something that could both heal and tank. That left me with, like, the option of Paladin or Monk. Or Druid, I guess, too. I could have literally just slotted in as a Druid, but we already had another Druid healer that was doing all right, and I liked Mistweaver gameplay. It was the healer gameplay I understood the most outside of Priest, in that it was something I goofed around with a lot because I legitimately enjoyed it. So I ended up switching to this character, specifically with the intent of healing when our Druid tank was present, and then tanking when he wasn't there, which is a terrible model to replace a tank or healer. I can only say never do that. If you are a raid leader, it sucks, because what it effectively means is that you then need a similar pinch hitter who can DPS one night and heal the next, and then you lose the DPS when that happens too. Like, there's basically no good outcome for it. We were inviting somebody like half of the time from another server, I want to say, even. Like, it was pretty messy, It wasn't a great situation. I wouldn't repeat it, but it was a good enough way for me to get into tanking, because what ended up happening pretty quickly during that process is that that druid just stopped logging on and eventually left our guild. So it went from an opening half the time to an opening full time for a tank, which then allowed me to really redouble and say, okay, I'm a tank. I'm going to be a tank full time. This is what I am. This is what I'm doing. So I managed to tank all of our normal Hellfire Citadel bosses, and then we got back into Heroic, which is where we were when we had to switch up the roster, and I had to start gearing up my my monk. And so from that point on, I was basically a full-time tank, and I got to do all the heroic encounters up to Archimond. We actually didn't clear Archimond as a guild. I managed to get the moose through a stream deal, so that worked out for me. But yeah, and then ever since then, I basically tanked. It was a foregone conclusion when Legion was coming out that I was going to tank, because we had people interested in healing, and we actually gained new players that wanted to heal. So I picked Vengeance Demon Hunter after I got to play the Legion Alpha, and I got to goof around with it. So I was like, fuck yeah, I want to do that. And I ended up kind of coming to it. But that doesn't really address my tankxiety personally, which I'll talk about real briefly. So when I decided I was actually going to switch to tanking / healing, I had to do a lot of like heroic dungeons up to mythic dungeons, which were in the game at that point, so that I could start gearing up and getting better stuff for tanking. I also wanted to make sure I did it as a tank instead of as a healer, because I needed to learn how Brewmaster played. The answer, if you remember late Warlords of Draenor, is that Brewmaster was fucking insanely powerful. I miss that spec so much. It was way too much fun because it was way too powerful. I think that's safe to say. Blizzard didn't really hit the mark on that one. I think they got it balanced enough that like mythic progression wasn't like completely fucked by it, but it was pretty goddamn powerful. I remember explicitly, like, the thing that occurred to me early on with Brewmaster gameplay at that point in the game was that it actually had a weird, like, incentive multiplier if you were bad at playing it because of the resolve mechanic. So, for those that weren't around for it, basically the core Brewmaster gameplay, unlike what it is today in Legion, was that resolve existed for all tanks to increase their healing and defensive capabilities for any absorbs they would have, based on the damage they received in a rolling window. So what it effectively meant as a Brewmaster monk is that if you took unmitigated hits to the face from the right boss, you could get so much resolve that you could then pop guard, which is your main defensive ability that you use to get damage absorption that made up for your lack of armor and damage mitigation through other means. And you could just have a 2 million shield when you had health around 600k. So the incentive was kind of weird in that you actually had a reward for playing poorly, which I later learned how to game it more properly so that you played properly and could still get big guards, because it was still pretty possible, because our active mitigation back in Warlords was kind of shitty. It was this weird thing where you had to stack brews based on multi-strikes or crits or something, and then when it stacked, each stack gave you like 1 second of the buff from your active mitigation. So at a bare minimum, you needed to have like 3 or 4 stacks of it up and then pop it, but it could go up to 15. So if you gamed it right, you could have this buff up perpetually, which was just extra dodge chance, but it also counted as active mitigation for mitigation checks. So it was pretty powerful. And then on top of that, you could have a guard for 2 million. You could have, you could pop your fortifying brew for even more damage reduction and health total. It got out of hand really quickly if you knew what you were doing. It could get out of hand really quickly if you didn't know what you were doing, but that was sort of the weird thing where it was unintentional. Like, learning Brewmaster was great because if you were bad at it, you could still be pretty good at it. And if you were good at it, you were fucking great at it. So I think if I had played any other class at that point in time, I probably would have been worse off. I tried actually Blood DK. I hated Blood DK. I still actually kind of loathe the current gameplay model because, as I said earlier, like the Death Strike thing, I understand it fundamentally, but it like fucks with my head in terms of the way the resource pooling and everything works around it, and making sure that you hit Death Strike just right. Because to me, when I hit Death Strike and I'm at full health but I need the mitigation check, it just bothers me. It makes me feel like I'm missing out on the healing I could have received from Death Strike, and that sucks, right? Like, that's not a good feeling. So at the end of the day, like, I think that being on a powerful spec helped overcome that anxiety. And I know that's bullshit advice and doesn't really help anybody, but if you have multiple tank alts and you're trying to learn to get over feeling anxious when you tank, that's a perfectly good way to get used to the fundamentals of just tanking. It's way easier to learn the path through a dungeon if you have a lot of good fail-safes in place than it is if you're on a class that you hate. Like, if I tried Prot Warrior right now to learn tanking, if I still had anxiety, I would get more anxious, because Prot Warrior tanking still makes me anxious because I understand it fundamentally, like with Death Strike, but in gameplay practice, I don't get it. I just don't. I've tried. I don't get it. Ignore Pain's weird. Shield block's weird. Self-sustain on a warrior's fucking weird. It all is like put together at like these weird clumsy angles. Like, I know why people like it, but I don't. And maybe I'm weird for that, but that's how I feel about it. But yeah, so then Legion came out. I did indeed switch to Vengeance Demon Hunter. I really actually almost decided to stay with my monk, but early on in Legion, if you were here for launch, like, Brewmaster Monk was in a weird spot at launch. Like, they went from being massively OP at the tail end of Warlords of Draenor to being weirdly gimpy. Like, now that I understand them, I like Ironskin Brew. And actually, even in 7.0, I did some tanking on my Brewmaster. I think my Brewmaster was like the second or third tune I leveled, I want to say. I might have actually leveled her before my Priest. But yeah, like, the model works. And it's great, like, right now. Like, I've actually done raid tanking on this character recently, and I like it. I feel good about it, but it was pretty rough. Like, there was actually a patch of time where, like, I wasn't sure about Vengeance enough to really stick to it. I'm glad I did stick to it to get ahead of that story, but I was actually starting to think I might stay with Brewmaster, or I might even go to, like, Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid would have probably been a really strong play because they've been fucking ridiculous throughout Legion, and they're probably going to remain ridiculous into Antorus because they're just so well built for the way the game is right now that even attempts to nerf them, like getting rid of Mark of Ursal, has only kind of done the trick. It hasn't really done the trick. Like, Guardian Druids are still way overrepresented, and not just because everybody geared up their Guardian Druid in Nighthold, but that definitely has something to do with it. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, I mean, going forward into Battle for Azeroth and all that, I don't think I would want to go back to healing. I enjoy healing as an off-spec activity. I enjoy doing it for LFR, for dungeons, all of that. And I do enjoy it in raids. I do it sometimes as an alt thing for our raids. But tanking, to me, now that I'm over the anxiety of it, tanking is also the easiest way to get appreciated in World of Warcraft. Healers get pretty well appreciated in Final Fantasy XIV, but they tend to be forgotten about in WoW for tanks. Being a good tank, being a great tank, in fact, is the easiest way for you to get lots of praise, lots of Battle.net friends, and to have constant reassurance that you're super valuable. So at the end of the day, like, I'm gonna probably be tanking for the rest of the time I play this game as a main spec, because the positive reinforcement, if nothing else, is really strong. And it especially helps, like with Vengeance Demon Hunter, to also be really powerful and badass at the same time. So yeah, that's the end of Storytime here today. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to see me stream, I have Twitch streams 6 nights a week over at twitch.tv/KaleRian. That's Monday through Saturday. My hours are posted on my page. I also have a blog where you can read some of my thoughts at kalerian.wordpress.com. It's all specific to gaming. And that's it for this video. So I will see you next time. when maybe we'll talk about how Resolve and Guard made for wacky interactions one more time.
Thank you.